Law enforcement agencies in the United States employ over 1 million officers. They operate in 18,000 separate jurisdictions. They respond to millions of calls every year, and yet specific failures repeat, not occasionally, consistently, across decades, across states, across agencies that have never communicated with each other. This video will walk through documented police failures, one by one, and by the end, you will understand why the same mistakes continue to occur, and why the structure itself guarantees that outcome. We are going to examine real cases. Cases where investigations were conducted, where official reports were published, where the timeline is not disputed. Each failure will be explained on its own terms. Each one will be traced to a documented structural cause. Nothing will be speculated. Nothing will be dramatized. On May 24, 2022, a gunman entered Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. 376 law enforcement officers from 23 different agencies responded to the scene. They waited 77 minutes before confronting the shooter. 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. The United States Department of Justice conducted a critical incident review. It analyzed over 14,000 pieces of data. It interviewed more than 260 people. The report was released in January 2024. It documented what it called cascading failures of leadership, decision-making, tactics, policy, and training. Officers entered the building 3 minutes after the gunman. They identified the location of the gunfire immediately. They approached the classrooms. They were hit with shrapnel. They retreated. From that moment forward, they treated the situation as a barricaded subject scenario, not as an active shooter situation. The report stated this was a critical mistake. Multiple stimulus events occurred after the retreat. 6 separate instances of gunfire. Approximately 45 rounds fired in the presence of law enforcement. Officer injuries. The presence of victims. None of these events prompted a shift in response. The report found that no one assumed a leadership role. No one directed the response toward the active shooter. No one established incident command. The report stated that leadership, from the Uvalde Police Department, the school district, the police department, the Uvalde County Sheriff's Office, and the Texas Department of Public Safety, demonstrated no urgency for establishing command and control. Witnesses reported that a child called 911 from inside the classroom. Officers were informed of the call. None of the officers who learned of it advocated for shifting to an active shooter response. The Justice Department concluded that had law enforcement agencies followed generally accepted practices in an active shooter situation, lives would have been saved. This failure had a documented cause. It was the absence of command structure. It would appear again. On February 14, 2018, a gunman killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. A sheriff's deputy named Scott Peterson was on campus. He was the school resource officer. He was armed. He was in uniform. He arrived at the building 36 seconds after the attack began. He did not enter. Security video showed he took cover 75 feet away. He stayed there for 40 minutes. The attack lasted less than 7 minutes. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement conducted a 15-month investigation. It interviewed 184 witnesses. The investigation found that Peterson refused to investigate the source of gunshots. He retreated during the active shooting while victims were being shot. He directed other law enforcement officers who arrived on scene to remain 500 feet away from the building. Peterson was arrested in June 2019. He was charged with 7 counts of neglect of a child, 3 counts of culpable negligence, 1 count of perjury. The charges carried a maximum potential sentence of 96.5 years. He was tried in June 2023. The prosecution argued that Peterson had a duty to engage. The defense argued that Peterson acted based on the information available to him. The defense emphasized the failure of the sheriff's radio system during the attack. The jury deliberated for 19 hours over 4 days. Peterson was acquitted on all counts. The acquittal was the first trial in United States history of a law enforcement officer for conduct during an on-campus shooting. Families of victims stated publicly that his inaction contributed to the pain of the entire community. The jury's decision related to the technical specifics of Florida law. The statute defined neglect as a caregiver's failure to make a reasonable effort to protect the child. The jury determined that Peterson did not meet the legal definition of caregiver. The investigation revealed the problem. the trial revealed the limitation of accountability. Both outcomes reinforced the same pattern. In 1983, Robert Du Bois was convicted of murder in Florida. He was sentenced to death. The conviction was based on forensic evidence. That evidence included bite mark analysis. Bite mark matching has since been discredited as a forensic method. DNA testing exonerated Du Bois in 2020. He had been imprisoned for 37 years. In February 2024, he received $14 million in compensation. The National Registry of Exonerations has documented over 3,000 cases of wrongful conviction in the United States. The Innocence Project has exonerated 375 people through DNA testing. 21 of those exonerees had been on death row. A study conducted by the National Institute of Justice analyzed 732 wrongful conviction cases. It examined 1,391 forensic examinations. The study found that most errors related to forensic evidence were not identification or classification errors made by forensic scientists. They were associated with incompetent or fraudulent examiners, disciplines with an inadequate scientific foundation, and organizational deficiencies in training, management, governance, or resources. 43% of DNA exonerations between 1989 and 2020 involved some form of misused or mishandled forensic evidence. Common errors included cross-contamination of samples, failure to maintain proper chain of custody, and loss or destruction of evidence before the defense had access to it. This was not misconduct in isolated cases. It was systemic failure in evidence handling. In 2008, the Detroit Crime Lab was closed due to a lack of quality control. Audits revealed errors in ballistics analysis, DNA testing, and drug testing. Cases were reopened. Convictions were reviewed. In 2011, the Nassau County Crime Lab in New York was shut down. An independent review found serious deficiencies in procedures. In 2012, Hall Police Crime Lab was closed. Management failures and quality control issues were documented. In Massachusetts, a forensic chemist named Annie Ducon was prosecuted and convicted for falsifying drug test results. Her misconduct affected more than 20,000 cases. Another chemist in Massachusetts, Sanja Farak, pleaded guilty to stealing drugs and tampering with evidence while working at a state crime lab. These lab closures and scandals were not the result of a single bad actor. They were the result of inadequate oversight, insufficient funding, lack of accreditation standards, and the absence of mandatory external audits. The same structural weaknesses produce the same outcomes in different states. Here is what connects these cases. They are not failures of individual effort. They are failures of design. An active shooter response requires immediate command and control. Uvalde had 376 officers from 23 agencies. None of them established unified command. Parkland had an armed officer on site. The legal system could not hold him accountable under existing statutes. Wrongful convictions are produced by forensic errors. Those errors are produced by labs that lack mandatory quality standards. Lab closures happen when funding is inadequate and oversight is absent. Each of these outcomes is predictable, each one has been documented before, and each one continues to occur. In 2004, the Justice for All Act was passed. It expanded access to post-conviction DNA testing. Before that law, only a handful of states allowed it. Even with the law, access remains restricted. In Alabama, DNA testing is only available to those charged with capital offenses. In Kentucky, people who plead guilty are barred from accessing DNA testing, even if they falsely confessed, even if they were coerced. These restrictions prevent wrongly convicted people from proving their innocence. They also allow the people who actually committed the crimes to remain undetected. The Innocence Project reports that DNA evidence is left behind in less than 10% of murders. This means that for the majority of wrongful convictions, there is no DNA evidence to test, and when there is, it must be preserved. Requirements for how long evidence must be preserved vary by state. When evidence is not preserved, exoneration becomes impossible. The law expanded access, but it did not remove the structural barriers that prevent that access from being used. For the families of victims in Uvalde, Parkland, and thousands of wrongful conviction cases, the absence of accountability became permanent. These cases did not resolve. They closed without resolution. The system moved on. The families did not. So why does this happen? Not in one case, in thousands. Law enforcement in the United States is decentralized by design. 18,000 agencies operate independently. They are funded locally. They set their own policies. They train their own officers. They respond to their own calls. When a mass casualty event occurs, multiple agencies respond. But there is no automatic command structure that applies across jurisdictions. Officers from different agencies use different radio systems. They follow different protocols. They do not train together. The result is what happened in Uvalde. 376 officers, no unified command, 77 minutes of inaction. Active shooter training exists. The Department of Justice report on Uvalde found that officers had received training in the months before the attack. But the training they received was improper. It did not reflect current best practices. The report documented that after the Columbine shooting in 1999, a fundamental precept of active shooter response was established. Immediately neutralize the subject. Everything else, including officer safety, is subordinate to that objective. Uvalde officers did not follow that precept. Parkland's school resource officer did not follow it either. The training existed, the execution did not. Forensic science failures follow the same pattern. The National Institute of Justice study found that forensic methods most frequently associated with wrongful convictions include forensic serology, microscopic hair analysis, and bite mark comparisons. These methods were used for decades. Some of them have since been discredited. But convictions based on those methods remain in place unless post-conviction DNA testing is available and accessible. And as documented, that access is limited by state law, by the availability of evidence, and by whether DNA was present in the first place. Lab failures are structural. Crime labs are funded at the local or state level. Accreditation is not mandatory in all states. External audits are not required universally. When a lab is underfunded or understaffed, quality control suffers. When quality control suffers, errors occur. When errors occur in a forensic lab, they affect every case that lab processes. Detroit, Nassau County, St. Paul, Massachusetts. These were not isolated incidents. They were predictable outcomes of a system that does not mandate oversight. Accountability is limited by law. The Parkland trial demonstrated this. The jury acquitted Peterson because the statute did not define a school resource officer as a caregiver. The statute was not written with that scenario in mind. The law could not be applied retroactively. The result is that even when failures are documented, even when the timeline is clear, even when the inaction is undisputed, legal accountability may not be possible. The failures will continue. Active shooter responses will continue to lack unified command, unless agencies train together and establish automatic command structures that activate when multiple jurisdictions respond. Forensic errors will continue unless all labs are required to meet accreditation standards, undergo external audits, and adhere to mandatory quality control programs. Wrongful convictions will continue unless access to post-conviction DNA testing is expanded, unless evidence preservation requirements are standardized, and unless outdated forensic methods are removed from use. And accountability will remain inconsistent unless statutes are revised to reflect the realities of modern policing. These are not recommendations. They are descriptions of what would need to change for the pattern to stop repeating. The structure has not changed. The failures continue. That is the distance between where we are and where the system would need to be. And until that distance closes, the same outcomes will occur.